Nintendo is one of the most important and iconic companies in the video game industry. They make some of the most interesting hardware on the market and load it up with amazing games. But that doesn't mean the Mario company gets everything right. Here are the 10 most unforgettable mistakes Nintendo has made. Before we dive in, please give us a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our videos. Okay, let's take a look at 10 unforgettable Nintendo video game mistakes. The Wii U. Here are two seemingly contradictory ideas. 1, the Wii U was a worthy console. 2, it was also a terrible mistake. Dun dun dun. It's easy to see how the Wii U catastrophe happened. Back in 2012, Nintendo was riding high on the success of the Wii. The Wii sold incredible numbers because it appealed to Nintendo fans and casual players alike. They were sold out all over the place. Games like Super Mario Galaxy and Twilight Princess were enough to convince loyal Nintendo fans to buy a Wii, and the user-friendly motion controls sold it to the casual sector. People who hadn't played a game console in decades bought a Wii, just so they could play virtual bowling and tennis. Grandparents bought a Wii. Aunts and uncles bought a Wii. It also helped that it was much cheaper than competing game consoles. Everybody had a Wii. After selling 100 million Wiis, of course Nintendo thought the Wii U would sell. The problem was, it didn't. Despite spending 5 years on the market, the Wii U would become the worst-selling Nintendo console of all time. One problem was Nintendo bungling the announcement so badly, many people who watched didn't realize a new console had been announced at all. Another problem was that the Wii U's pricey gamepad controller didn't offer any obvious advantage. Third-party developers shied away, and so did potential customers. Thankfully, Nintendo seems to be back on track with the Switch, a console players actually want to buy. Go figure. The Nintendo 3DS launch. Speaking of troubled consoles, the Nintendo 3DS also got off to a rough start. Following in the shadow of the Nintendo DS, the best-selling handheld video game console in history, Nintendo must have been feeling pretty smug about itself. The new big innovation for Nintendo's next handheld, the 3DS, was that it could display 3D graphics without making players strap on a pair of dumb-looking glasses. Unfortunately, just as buyers rejected the supposed 3D television revolution, they weren't too keen to shell out a bunch of cash for a 3D handheld gaming system either. Initial sales numbers were so bad, Nintendo had to cut the price by $80 just 4 months after launch. To appease early buyers who paid full price and felt duped out of their money, Nintendo gave them a digital slate of 20 classic games from the NES and Game Boy Advance. 20 games! Now there's a deal. Despite the ill will Nintendo earned during the 3DS's launch, the system eventually achieved a good deal of success, selling 70 million units during its lifetime. That's less than half of what the DS sold, but it's about the best Nintendo could have expected seeing as it launched during the smartphone era. Turns out it's tough to sell someone a dedicated portable gaming device when people can just pull out their phone and have access to hundreds of thousands of games. Yeah, that makes some sense. Using cartridges for Nintendo 64. Technology was at a crossroads in 1996. Sony had just entered into the video game space a year before with the original PlayStation, which sported the relatively new technology of CD-ROMs. Compared to cartridges, CDs were dirt cheap to make and offered all the storage video games needed to hold three-dimensional worlds for players to explore. On the other hand, cartridges would load much faster than CDs, but at a sizable cost. Cartridge storage was expensive, which meant big games were expensive to produce. When it came time to make a successor to the SNES, Nintendo went with cartridges over CDs. I think it was the love of blowing into the bottom, you know? History shows this was a mistake. The PlayStation was a major success for Sony, selling more than 100 million units over the course of its life. The Nintendo 64, meanwhile, moved just over 30 million units. And if you need help on the math there, well, don't ask us, math is hard. The discrepancy between those numbers isn't completely due to the price and technical limitations of cartridges. Let's just say you're a third-party developer who wants to make a big game. If you could save a bunch of money and make a better-looking game by publishing it on a CD compared to a cartridge, which one would you choose? Yeah, we figured. Most game developers chose CDs. That's particularly why Nintendo lost the Final Fantasy series to the PlayStation, and why massive cinematic games like Metal Gear Solid didn't come out on Nintendo 64. Ignoring third-party developers. During the days of the NES and SNES, Nintendo had a great relationship with third-party developers, BFFs even. Many of the best Nintendo and Super Nintendo games were made by companies like Capcom, Tecmo, and Konami. Without third-party support, Nintendo fans wouldn't have gotten to play games like Castlevania or Street Fighter II. But after the SNES, Nintendo started making weirder hardware. Some of these hardware choices turned out to be great, like the analog stick on the N64 controller. Others were less great, like the Wii U's gamepad controller. But each oddball piece of hardware contributed to a growing distance between Nintendo Nintendo and third-party game makers. As mentioned earlier, it really started with Nintendo's use of cartridges in the Nintendo 64. When third-party developers saw they could make bigger, better-looking games on CD-based systems, that's where they took their games. It makes a whole lot of sense. The trend continued with the GameCube, a system that used tiny discs instead of DVDs like the competition. And when the Wii and Wii U came out, each of them were underpowered and used gimmicky controls. By that point, many third-party developers simply gave up working with Nintendo. With the Switch, Nintendo seems to be turning this trend around and making nice with some of the third-party developers. But still, developers need to make concessions to get their games up and running on such unique hardware. It remains to be seen how much third-party support Nintendo can actually muster on the Switch. Not partnering with Sony. The history of video games might look quite different if Nintendo could go back to the mid-90s and change one big mistake. Maybe there's an alternate dimension somewhere where this happened. The mistake happened during the Nintendo era, when Nintendo and Sega were duking it out for video game dominance. To get a technological leg up, Nintendo partnered with Sony to build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. This so-called SNES CD would play existing Super Nintendo games, but it would also play new games printed on compact discs. The project got far enough that Sony and Nintendo made numerous prototypes of the console, which would eventually be nicknamed the Nintendo PlayStation. Get it? But in exchange for developing the CD side of the machine, Sony wanted to maintain control over the new disc format it developed. Nintendo couldn't give up control over such a key component of the machine, so it backed out of the deal. As gamers know, Sony soon decided to get into the video game business without Nintendo's help. As time went on, most PlayStation consoles ended up outselling Nintendo's competing machines. Imagine what the gaming landscape would look like if only Nintendo had held on to Sony as a partner in the 90s. It would have been a vastly different industry, possibly with some other big hardware maker occupying Sony's current position. What company might it be? Possibilities include Apple, Sega, or Samsung, among others. Virtual Boy. Like the Wii U, Nintendo's Virtual Boy was a bungled attempt to create a new piece of gaming hardware. Unlike the Wii U, the Virtual Boy didn't hang around on the market for years after Nintendo fans rejected it. The Virtual Boy came out in 1995, but you'd be forgiven if you don't remember ever seeing it on a store shelf. Virtual Boy was essentially a headset, even though you couldn't strap it onto your head. Instead, you placed it on a stand and had to press your face up against it to play games. Kind of like those things at the eye doctor that puff air into your eyeball. On the plus side, Virtual Boy games were in 3D, but everything else about the console was a drawback. Unlike colorful systems like the Super Nintendo and PlayStation, the Virtual Boy could only display games in two colors, black and red. This fact, along with the sheer physical discomfort of smashing your face into a piece of plastic for hours on end, made it a tough sell for gamers at the time. I wonder why. All told, only 22 Virtual Boy games ever came out. Thanks to poor reviews from critics and near total disregard from gamers, Nintendo pulled the console from shelves just 7 months after its release. Just think of all the resources Nintendo poured into designing and manufacturing the Virtual Boy, only to see it fall flat on its face. Now that is a big mistake. Being bad at the internet. Nintendo has pioneered all kinds of innovative ideas over the years. Putting 2 screens on the Nintendo DS seemed like a crazy idea when it first came out, but that system went on to sell in droves. The Wii's motion controllers were inviting enough to encourage many non-gamers to play video games for the first time. So why has Nintendo continually failed when it comes to online connectivity? With console after console, they just keep mucking it up, requiring players to share unique friend codes for each game they want to play online with their buddies. It's not like this is a tough problem to solve either. For years and years, Sony and Microsoft had offered standard friends lists, which let you play your games online with any of your friends. It's uncomplicated, it's easy. But on all Nintendo consoles before the Switch, you had to individually add friends using unique codes for each game you play. Yeah, doesn't make much sense. It was a nightmare to keep track of who you were friends with in which games. The whole thing was messy enough that you might have thrown your Wii U out the window and bought a PS4 just to play online with ease. With the Switch, Nintendo has finally made some steps towards unifying your friends across your whole library of games, but surprise, surprise, it's still kind of clunky. Figure it out, Nintendo! Bad voice acting in Zelda Breath of the Wild. There's no doubt The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is an incredible video game. It drops you in an enormous world and gives you an incredible amount of freedom to explore nearly every inch of it. It has forests, deserts, icy tundras, puzzles, and enemies galore. It's fantastic. On top of all that, it has an incredibly deep physics engine that lets Link climb just about any wall and use the elements to his advantage. It's an astonishing achievement in a dozen different ways. So, why, when someone has something to say in a cutscene, does the game suddenly sound like a middle school play?
The fate of Hyrule rests with you.
The voice acting isn't just bad, it's so awful it pulls you out of the otherwise brilliantly rendered game world. How much better would Breath of the Wild be if they just stuck with on-screen text for the entire game? Sure, players expect to hear video game characters talk nowadays, but text would just get the job done. Better yet, they could have hired voice actors who could read their lines without making players wince in embarrassment the moment they open their lips. Good thing the gamer has such awesome voice actors, huh? Bad voice acting isn't enough to ruin a game, but it's one of the few marks against it. A game this ambitious and masterful deserves a talented cast of voice actors who can pull off the scenes and add to the immersion of the game. I'm ready, Nintendo. Have your people call my people. Power Glove. Nintendo has released many questionable peripherals over the years, but the Power Glove for the NES seems to have more promise than most. Shown off in the movie The Wizard, starring the lovable kid from the Wonder Years, the Power Glove looked like a cool, innovative way to control games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Yeah, we were fooled too. Kids convinced their parents to buy them the Power Gloves in droves. Once the little NES owners opened their new toys, they rushed to their consoles, plugged in their Power Gloves, and howled in frustration because the Power Glove was an unforgivably terrible controller. For starters, this thing was uncomfortable to wear. It was hot enough that you'd start sweating immediately once you began waving your hand in a futile attempt to move Mario or punch Piston Honda. The real problem was that it was completely unresponsive. In commercials, kids would control games flawlessly just by gesturing with their gloved hands. Advertising. In reality, it took 20 tries to get your character to move a single pixel, let alone make any progress through levels that were retro-challenging. If nothing else, the Power Glove proved you couldn't trust commercials. Everyone who bought a Power Glove just lost a piece of their innocence when they tried it on and got steamrolled by the first enemy they encountered. Poor kids. Having Peach get kidnapped again in Odyssey. I'm not here to tell Nintendo how to make a game, but how many times has Bowser kidnapped Princess Peach again? 1, 2, 3, is it more than 100? Because it seems like it must be. Over the decades, Peach has spent more and more time imprisoned by Bowser than free in her own castle. Surely Nintendo's latest greatest Mario game on the Nintendo Switch tweaks the formula, right? Wrong. It starts out just the same as all the others, with Bowser flying off with Peach in tow. The only difference is, this time he's gonna forcibly marry her. Wow, that's terrifying. Isn't it time the writers at Nintendo put on their thinking caps and come up with some new ideas? Because rescuing the princess was the kind of low-hanging narrative fruit players expected in a video game when the first Mario came out in the 1980s. But in the world we live now, that plot is staler than a dry bones in a ghost house. Sure, no one plays a Mario game for the thrilling story. You play them because it's fun to jump into question blocks and stomp Goombas. It's also a blast to collect coins and moons. We don't really need a story at all, but if Nintendo insists on giving us one, can't they come up with something fresher than a tale that was already dull when we first saw it 3 decades ago? Alright, now we're only tough on Nintendo because we love them. Tough love, baby. For all the company's mistakes, they've given us some of the very best video game hardware and software ever created. No one's perfect, not even the Mario Company. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Also be sure to subscribe to The Gamer and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our great video content. Thanks for watching.